Well, despite what people tend to say about politicians, you'd actually be hard-pressed to find one that went through the ordeal of seeking a nomination, campaigning door to door, and possibly getting elected with an eye to doing nothing and having no influence. To a person, they're usually motivated by a desire to serve their communities. Alex Marland is a professor of political science at Memorial University. His new book examines one of the ways that hopeful ambition can hit a brick wall. It's called Whipped: Party Discipline in Canada. And Alex Marland joins us now from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Alex, good to see you again. How you doing?
I'm okay. Thank you for having me.
Glad to hear it. Let's set up our conversation with my reading an excerpt from your book right off the top here. Here we go. Political parties are essential for keeping large numbers of politicians organized. However, the systematic integration of politicians is so successful that some believe Canada has the most rigid party discipline of any liberal democracy, and that party government has supplanted parliamentary government. The tight binds of partisanship among Canadian politicians are at odds with political parties' loosening grip on the electorate. The near iron hand of party discipline that keeps parliamentarians in the fold is arguably the greatest frustration that Canadians have with their system of government. Let's get into this, Alex. How do you see that frustration manifesting itself moreover?
I'm glad that you have that quote because there's so many things that are in it. I think one of the things to think about is the more that Canadians learn about political parties, I think the more frustrated they would get. Anybody who becomes a candidate with a political party instantly starts realizing that they are not a free agent, that they are joining a political club, they are part of a team, they are supposed to follow the rules of that team, and then you become an MP or an MPP, and the rules get even tighter for you, and you start realizing that, wow, I'm not here to make a difference. I'm here to represent my party. I mean, this is not what I signed up for. And so generally, I would say that this is the challenge for a lot of people. They become reduced to voting machines. They become party robots. They become trained seals. And for the average Canadian, it's not a good look. It doesn't make us think that we have a vibrant democracy when parties are so powerful.
And how did you conclude that we seem to have the strictest system out of all of the Westminster-style parliaments?
Well, it's not so much that I've concluded that, it's that political scientists have said that a number of times. So the research that I've done has looked exclusively at Canada, but drawing upon what other researchers have done points out that, Canada's is some of the strictest. Some work that has been done that does look at Canada says that, there were politicians in the last parliament who voted 100% of the time with their party. 100%. There wasn't a single time they voted against the party. I mean, how is this possible? And a lot of them would say it's because they inherently support the party. They support the leader. But a lot of us would say, well, it just doesn't make sense. Surely there's got to be times where you disagree. So what is it about the system that compels you to always vote with your party?
Well, I found one of the most interesting numbers in your book related to a guy who represents a riding in the capital city here in Ontario. His name's Nate Erskine-Smith. I think he represents Beaches, East York. And I've always regarded him as a bit of a maverick, who would be prepared to buck his party when he felt his conscience required him to do so. And yet you tell us he voted with his party 96.1% of the time, which, was very eye-opening to me. Which of the federal parties actually is the most disciplinarian when it comes to voting?
Oddly, from what I've seen, it ends up being the NDP. And in a way, that's odd because we think of the NDP as, supporting democracy. I mean, it's the new Democratic Party. But part of the reason for that is because of the ideological coherence in the NDP that, if you're going to be a member with that party, you support organized labor, you support all sorts of principles in their constitution. The real test is really whether you are in government or whether you're in opposition. When you're in opposition, you're not obliged to vote the party line with the same amount of pressure as when you're in government. And for me, this is probably the main thing that I found that is so troubling. If you are a part of the governing party and you're part of the government side of the House and you're a backbencher, meaning you're not part of cabinet, there's still an expectation that you vote with the government all the time. And not only voting with the government, but you're promoting government messages. So you become a messenger from the government when really you're meant to be holding the government to account. It's a real frustration for how the system is designed.
Well, it's interesting. That transformation has really been quite profound because once upon a time, the way you just described it is the way it was supposed to be. Backbenchers were part of the system to keep the government and the cabinet in check. In fact, I think the expression you used is they're now brand ambassadors. What are the implications of that change?
Right. So, part of what I'm suggesting is politicians have moved from being foremost lawmakers, and then they became constituency caseworkers. And now, as I see it, they become brand ambassadors. The idea being that they are promoting messages of the party, of the leader, and on the government side of the government. The biggest problem is that stifles free discussion and debate in the public domain. So you end up having politicians who are given messages and are constantly promoting these messages and can't really get into any real substantive conversation other than supporting the party line publicly. Because if they do, it's controversial. The media will pick up immediately. Opponents will draw on it, will say, oh my gosh, this person is disagreeing with their leader. This is a big news story. So there's all these pressures on politicians to stay with the party whenever they're speaking publicly, which of course doesn't sound very much healthy for democracy.
Well, let me, for argument's sake, put the other side of the argument out there, which is in caucus, which are supposed to be private conversations, members of parliament or members of their provincial legislatures are encouraged to be combative as heck. They're allowed to have good, vibrant, energetic debates about things, but that once the party comes to a decision, whatever that means, they're expected to sing from the same hymn book, and they're expected to go out there and be loyal team members. What's wrong with that?
So a lot of politicians say nothing is wrong with that. And in fact, you have to do that because if not, you'll get eaten alive. But here is a fundamental thing that I'm not sure that everybody is fully aware of, is something that has fundamentally changed, other than obviously all the changes with the media, is that staff now have a permanent presence in caucus meetings. That did not used to be the case. That is something that has transformed in the last 10, 15 years. It seems to be intensifying. Certainly there's a large presence of staff in Justin Trudeau's caucus meetings and other premiers. And the staff will say, well, they have to do it. Information moves so quickly nowadays that they need to be there and hear things in real time. Here's the problem. Staff have an incredible amount of power over the career of a politician. And even if the staff says, I don't really, the bottom line is the politician thinks that they do. So what happens is in the caucus meeting, they don't feel free to speak up. A lot of the free dialogue you talk about happens in the regional caucus meetings, in the smaller meetings where staff may not be present.
I wonder if, as well, there's a generational thing here, because a lot of these staff tend to be in their 20s and 30s, and a lot of elected politicians tend to be in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I'm guessing that people who actually went out, took the courage to put their name on a ballot, got themselves elected, do not want to be taking orders from a bunch of young whippersnappers. Is that part of it?
That has been going on for a long time. There's an expression you might have heard, boys in short pants, which is not just exclusive to boys by any means. There is an incredible amount of frustration and a lot of annoyance, frankly, when somebody who has a lot of experience and expertise is told by essentially a young whippersnapper, look, you're not doing this right, or you'd better do the following. The challenge I think that staff are not always familiar with is how much power they convey just by representing the office of the premier or representing the office of the prime minister or any leader's office, that it's a perception that is held by the people they're speaking with that they themselves may not always be aware of.
Now, let's do a real life example here. And of course, there are tons to pick from, but one of the ones you raised in the book, which it just said everything about what you're railing against here, was a British Columbia member of parliament by the name of David Wilkes. And we're going back almost a decade now. And he's, I gather, in a diner or a coffee shop or something like that, talking to some constituents about some issues related to the upcoming budget. He was a Stephen Harper member of parliament, conservative member of parliament. And he just was sort of explaining to people why he had to vote the way he had to vote. And it turned into a huge controversy and really affected his career. Fill in the blanks, if you would, on that story.
Okay, so this David Wilkes is a backbench member of the Conservative government with Stephen Harper. He holds a meeting with a number of constituents, and they're sitting around saying, why don't you just vote against the budget? This is wrong. We don't want you to support this. So he explains how the system works. He says, look, As a backbencher, if I vote against the budget, I'm no longer going to be part of the caucus. That's simply the way it works. It's the confidence convention. For anything to to really affect change on the budget, there would have to be maybe a dozen backbenchers who would all stand up and say, "We're not going to take this." So there's really no point. If I vote against the budget, the next day I will no longer be part of the party, and my political career will probably be over. And so they're all trying to understand this. And he's, very democratic. He says, sure, I don't mind if you record this. That's fine. And so somebody records it, puts it up on YouTube. Well, you can guess what happens after that. All sorts of people. There's all this controversy. It's in the media. It's talked about all over the place. And everybody's saying, this is terrible. How can he be saying this? And more than that, people start demonstrating. They start mobilizing and saying, we need to get 12 Tories all together to vote against the budget. Anyway, he gets called into the whip's office. He's told to apologize. And he's taken off some committees. He ends up not being very satisfied about his political career. And now he's a mayor. And I think that he's much happier as a mayor than he was when he was in Ottawa.
But if I remember from your book, Stephen Harper actually had a conversation with him about this too, didn't he?
Yeah, and this was one of the interesting things is a lot of us think that the leader's fingers are all over this, especially somebody like who is powerful as Stephen Harper. But frankly, a lot of it gets delegated. I've been told that it's not a good idea to have the prime minister or others bothered by these sorts of details. It's stressful. And so what happens is it gets delegated. So whether it's to staff or to the whip or somebody else, they're the ones who are dealing with all of these internal challenges that are going on about getting people to toe the party line. So a lot of the discipline is actually, it's more of a collegial discipline than it is necessarily coming from the leader directly.
I asked this next question cognizant of the fact that I'm sitting here in the William G. Davis studio, named after the former Ontario Premier here at TVO. And the question is this, I wonder if, as much as backbenchers don't like the phenomenon you've described, they do put up with it to a great extent, unlike many in the United States who seem to relish the hurly-burly aspects of politics down there. And I wonder if it's because, as Bill Davis once said when asked, why do you run such a bland, boring government? His answer was, bland works. And I wonder if our Canadian temperament, which presumably extends to these politicians, partly accounts for the reason why there are so few revolutionaries on the backbenches.
I mean, there's some truth to what you're saying. I think political parties want that. They certainly want party soldiers who are not causing trouble. But out here in Newfoundland and Labrador, there's been a number of colorful personalities over the years, and people like John Crosby and Brian Tobin have really found a way to develop their own personalities. I would encourage you to think about the current cabinet at the federal or provincial level. Think about backbenchers. It's really hard to think of mavericks and strong personalities the way that they used to exist in the past. So I would say that what's happening is with social media and the ability to monitor what people are doing, we're really seeing political parties exert their control and saying, look, you better not go out of line publicly. You'd better stay with the message because otherwise there's going to be trouble.
Well, let's state the obvious here as well, which is you don't have to go to the backbenches to find these examples. We have one in the last few years in the nation's capital where Jane Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould, two members of the cabinet of Justin Trudeau, were unhappy with the way that he handled the SNC-Lavalin affair, and as a result, ultimately made their concerns known outside of caucus, and both of them were drummed out of the caucus. And of course, Jane Philpott's out of politics now, and Jody Wilson-Raybould came back, was fortunate enough to get reelected as an independent. When you look at that situation, what conclusion do you come to?
Well, thanks for raising that, because I was fortunate enough to interview both of them for this book, and there is a section about the SNC-Lavalin crisis or affair, I guess. There's a lot of layers to it. I think we need to think about the fact that the SNC-Lavalin dispute was foremost a policy dispute within the government, but then it transformed into a party issue once those two women were no longer part of cabinet. Why were they not allowed to stay within the Liberal Party? Why is it that they ended up getting the boots? And part of it was because they were still speaking and communicating with the media. The idea is essentially, once you are part of the caucus and once you are a backbencher, you are meant to stay quiet, stay out of it. If they had not spoken to the media whatsoever, they would have done a disservice to Canadian democracy, but they would have done a service to the Liberal Party of Canada. And so that's a different way of looking at how our democracy works.
Let's pull another excerpt out of the book here. Sheldon, I am at the bottom of page 3, if you could bring up this quote. Just 4 to 5% of the Canadian electorate prioritizes candidate factors in elections, a percentage even lower in urban areas among less informed voters and outside of Quebec. Voter assessments of local candidates matter to the outcome of elections in only 10 to 14% of seats. This means that candidates make a difference in close races, but otherwise have no practical bearing on who wins or who loses. If political parties did not exist, or even if party labels did not appear on the ballot, then voters would be more attuned to their local representatives. This is absolutely true, and it's got to be incredibly depressing for those who put their names on ballots and think those names matter at all. How depressed should we all be about the fact that the people who take the trouble to put their name on ballots and knock on 30,000 doors, and it accounts for next to nothing at the end of the day?
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, isn't it? I mean, I think you always have to look at the good and the bad. And the good is that with, the synthesizing of messaging, we have a lot of clarity about what political parties stand for. So when somebody is going to vote and they're trying to think about leaders, they're trying to think about parties and their positions, at least there's clarity. And that's a good thing. The challenge, of course, is that your average representative is not going to make much of a difference to the party about whether or not they're able to win or lose the seat. And a number of people I've interviewed tell me this sort of thing, that they are told all the time, look, you are probably going to make the difference between 10% of winning or losing. Your chances are 90% of the vote is coming from the leader, it's coming from the party. So you better do what we tell you. But on the flip side, what the parties are doing is saying, we need you to knock on doors because we need you to generate data about constituents. We need you to put these in these pads that are going to get uploaded to the cloud so that we can in turn contact people for money and ask them to donate, make sure that they turn out to vote, ask them to show up for an event. And if you do anything wrong, you're going to be cut off from that database, which is even more challenging.
Let's ask the big if question here, which is, and I'll make the comparison to Westminster in the United Kingdom, where they do allow a lot more free votes and where backbenchers are allowed to act more independently than they are in Canada. If we allowed that much independence on the backbench or among cabinet ministers in this country, what do you think the implications would be?
Well, it's always hard to know for sure. So all we can really do is look at the past. And the reality is that any time that you have a fundamental principle of being part of cabinet is whatever one minister says has to represent the government as a whole. So that whole system would kind of collapse, that you'd have this problem where you'd have ministers expressing different points of view and everybody would be saying, well, what is the government's position? So they all have to stay together as a united front. The bigger question is what would happen if political parties allowed more flexibility? Could they have more free votes? Could they have more opportunities for people to speak their minds? And I think some parties would say, yeah, we do allow that on some private members' bills and things that are low stakes. Occasionally there are free votes on things that they can't get everybody together on. But the bottom line is, I would say that what would be healthy for Canadian democracy is if we saw a few more independents elected every now and then. Some more independents, we couldn't have too many of them because the system wouldn't work, but some more independents who are free of the shackles of any political party would allow people to speak up and say things that the other parties may not be willing to say.
Let me get you to comment on an example that I'm sure very few people know about in Canada, but it works for them and it's quite fascinating. In Nunavut, they have no parties. They have a non-partisan legislative assembly, and somehow, I guess, stuff gets done. Could that system be transported to provincial legislative assemblies, for example, and still work as it apparently does there?
Yeah, great point. So it's known as consensus government. It exists in the Northwest Territories as well. And what happens is people run for election. There's no political party. After the election, all of the members gather together and conduct a vote to identify who should be the premier. And in some ways, that's great because you remove all this power of political parties. I would say it's in many ways anti-democratic to have a bunch of elected officials decide who the premier ought to be instead of the general public having a clear say on who that leader ought to be. But that aside, could it work in the provinces? From the research, the limited research I've done in this area, I'm of the opinion that it could potentially work in small places. So it could work in Prince Edward Island. It could work here, potentially in Newfoundland and Labrador. it could not work in Ontario. There's just way too many people. It only seems to work when there's a very small number of legislators, because once there's a larger number, we can see this in the Senate, people start breaking up into groups.
Let me, down to our last few minutes here, and I do want to ask you about the fact that people spoke to you very candidly, it seems, for your book, but of course, they're out. When people are in, you know, this kind of honesty about the rot of the system does not tend to come to the fore. What do we do about that?
Well, there were a number of people who are in the system who would speak with me. The difference is they were more likely to say, don't say who I am. So
Right.
they wanted to be anonymous because there's career implications. What can we do about it? I don't know that we can do a lot about it. It's a real challenge, especially with the media. When the media starts reporting on unnamed sources, you know, there's a challenge there because they can use the media to conduct you know, trial balloons and maybe say something negative about somebody, and we don't have that level of accountability. I would say that for me, one thing that one person who really got me to rethink about things is Stockwell Day. When I interviewed him, he was originally for another book. He said he only does interviews if he is on the record. And I thought about that and I thought, why is our default to always protect people's identities? Why shouldn't the default be in academia to say, look, I'd like to be able to name you. Is that okay with you? And actually, it turns out in this book, a lot of people wanted to be named. They just don't want quotes attributed to them.
Well, let's finish up on this then. If somebody watching us right now is thinking of running for office someday, but now is questioning the wisdom of that decision because they don't want to be a trained seal on the back bench, they'd actually like to achieve or accomplish something, what's your advice?
So my advice would be to take a look at some of the research that the Samara Center for Democracy has done. They have a lot of research about explaining what life is like as a parliamentarian. As well, this particular book that I've written, the final chapter is a list of items, how to be a strong parliamentarian. So I compiled all the different points of view and tips and advice that politicians provided to me. And it's a summary, and it says, look, this is what you can do. And I think there's a lot more that can be accomplished than people realize. The biggest challenge that I suspect that a lot of people don't realize is you have to put in a lot of work to build a consensus. You have to build a consensus in the caucus. If there's a government, the cabinet eventually has to agree. You have to make sure interest groups and the general public have support. You have to really work hard to mobilize. And so the idea that you can just walk into a room and say, I think we should do this policy is not going to work. You have to work hard to affect change.
Well, I must confess, when I picked up Whipped, at almost 400 pages about party discipline, I wasn't sure that this was going to be a page turner, but I got to say, you've got great stories in here, and you've made a real great contribution to our better understanding the nature of Canadian and provincial politics in the country today. That's Alex Marland, the author of Whipped, Party Discipline in Canada. He's a professor of political science at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Alex, thanks so much. Thanks for coming on to TVO tonight.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.